We have the age of AI, and of course, some people think how to do it right. We have the author here today, Geoff Gibbins, who is the author of Critical Intelligence Strengthening Human Thinking in the Age of AI. Hello and welcome, Geoff Gibbins.
Hi, Niels. Great to be here.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for taking the time and greetings to New York City. With your book, of course, I'm getting straight into it here. Um, why do you think that now? Because many people now say, hey, we have AI, and maybe some jobs are at risk, and maybe we don't need that many humans anymore. However, your take is more a bit than human thinking matters more. How do you justify that when many leaders at the moment think, with AI, we might get just a flexible computer instead of all these people who cause a bit of drama and difficulties in the workplace? Why do you think that human thinking now suddenly matters more?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first thing I'd start with is I think a lot of people obviously think that with AI, there's a lot of opportunity from automation. I think actually a lot of companies are finding that's actually quite difficult to get done though. The immediate gains that people were hoping for are not really materializing. And what we find is that companies are looking at AI as a technology adoption issue, and they will give access to tools and then see that it doesn't really work out. They get people not really understanding quite how to use it. They don't really see the quality of the output, or they might actually see the quality of the output just gets blindly accepted and then put into workflows, and you have a lot of issues of quality. And so then you have companies dialing back all their efforts to look at automation and the use of AI. And I'd say what really is behind this is that there's a real issue in businesses and society around critical thinking. So if you think about what AI is really good at, AI is really good at memorizing things. It's really good at completing individual tasks. Um, what it's not so good at is the ability to think about, well, what's the question that should be asked, right? And in a world where AI can answer any question in seconds or minutes, then really what matters is what's the question that you ask it and how do you evaluate what comes out of the AI system you're using and how do you put that into practice? And so that human judgment is really important and it's not really taught. And a lot of research shows that if you look at universities and colleges, critical thinking is not really taught. But when it is taught, it actually improves people's critical thinking, but also their ability to remember and adopt what they're learning too. And so if you think about the world of AI, we've got this critical thinking crisis that already existed. Now you have people with very easy access to lots of outputs from AI all the time, and they need the tools and the judgment to think about how do they access these outputs? How do they think about where they should be giving AI the ability to make decisions and where should they be playing a role in that? And actually, what's even more interesting once you dig into it is that AI can be a critical enabler of improving your critical thinking. So actually, I can work with AI in a deliberate way to think about what are the biases I might have in the way I approach topics, what are the mental models that I'm using to think about something, and how might I use a different one, and even just take a step back and think about where are the blind spots that I have in my overall thinking, and how can AI give me a path to improving that?
Excellent. When you now say, okay, sometimes people just use AI and then put it into workflows, and suddenly you see, the results aren't too great. On the one hand, people think this might end up with over-reliance. On the
Yes.
other hand, people will now say, if I don't want to have over-reliance, so I move away from that, I suddenly invested in tools and I have underutilization on the other side. So how do I balance these two to not fall in the trap of either over-relying on the one side or having an underutilization on the other and wasted money in my balance sheet?
Yeah. So I think it comes down to thinking about, first of all, within your job, what are the critical things that AI can play a big role in, and what are the things that you should work on maintaining your control over, right? So once you have a clear sense of that, that gives you a good sense of where should you apply it and where should you not, and at least at first. And then also, where are there areas where you want AI to play a partial role, but also you maintain some oversight and final decision making in that. And so having that checks and balances in place is really important. And so in the book, Critical Intelligence, I go into what are the different modes in which you can actually work with AI and think about how do you select the right mode deliberately and then figure out when to switch. So it might be that you figure out if you're generating content, for example, that the pure generation of ideas is something you should just let the AI run with, but then you need to make sure that you have someone fact checking it, or that you need to make sure that you have regulatory review, whatever it might be. You think about where are the steps in the process where AI can play a dominant role and where does it need to take a step back.
Excellent. And I think in your book you write about the 8 capabilities for critical intelligence. Can you give us an insight into that?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first few capabilities are really about the foundational capabilities of critical thinking. So how do you actually understand reasoning and unpacking arguments? How do you look then at understanding biases and mental models that you use and spotting that in your own work and getting help from AI and assessing that? How do you think about information literacy, which is how do you evaluate the information that's thrown at you, which is more and more every day, and figure out what you can trust? And then the last of these first four capabilities around critical thinking is what I call metacognition. And so this is all about how do you think deliberately about how you think. That's not something AI can do, but it's actually a human superpower that people can put into practice to figure out how can they get more out of their work. So those are the first four. And then the other four capabilities are really around how do you actually deliberately work with AI in an effective way. So the first piece is about understanding how AI systems work. And so that's not prompt engineering. It's not about how do I write the right thing into ChatGPT. It's about understanding the ways in which AI spots patterns and thinks differently to humans in order to figure out what's the right way to understand the role it should play. The second of these is about human AI collaboration. So, how do you figure out what are the different modes of how you collaborate with AI, whether it's a human in the driver's seat or human taking a backseat role, and how do you adapt between those different modes?
Hmm.
And then the last two are around human AI evaluation. So, how do you evaluate the work of AI, but also how do you think about the way that AI can evaluate you? So, I think we often think about how do I fact check and see if there's hallucinations in the data from AI? We're moving into a new world where people are going to be working in human AI teams where AI is evaluating you and your work. There's probably going to be an AI evaluating how well you evaluate AI, and there might be humans evaluating how AI evaluates that, and so on and so on. And so this much more complex world of evaluation that we're entering into. And then the last piece, which I think really resonates with people when I talk about it, is about how do you think about how do you adapt your skills in the world of AI? So AI is getting better at new tasks and new capabilities every week, seemingly. And so what's really important is to think about where are the things that are really important in your work that are going to be hard to automate and AI is just not as good at, and how can you cultivate and strengthen those things? So in the book, I talk about the example of an architect. So if you're an architect, there are some things you've got that are easily automatable, right? So do you know the building codes? Do you know how to
Hmm.
use a piece of software? We know now that AI is really good at memorizing building codes and they change, as well
Yeah.
as actually starting to use software and the software changes too. So those are things that can be pretty easily automated, and you probably might think they have a fairly short half-life as a skill. The other types of skills around client management, how do you actually build a relationship with the client? Spatial awareness, those are things that are much harder for AI to actually get right, at least in the next few years. And so those are the areas where, like an architect, for example, might look at cultivating those skills and making those more prominent in their practice.
Excellent. And when we talk about especially these more difficult and complex tasks, and even if we talk about just implementing AI, I found a fascinating number in your book. Tell me if I'm wrong. 74% of employees using AI have received no training. Is that correct?
Well, I think they haven't had formal training on the AI, and then what we find is also that they haven't had formal training on how to evaluate the outputs too. So this is the other piece. So I work with companies all the time on AI adoption and AI literacy, and you see one that people haven't been trained on how to use the tools fundamentally. They've just been told, give it a try and see what happens.
Good luck with that. Yeah.
Good luck with that and sort of experiment, which is a good thing to try out. But then the other piece is actually giving people the critical evaluation tools. And so how do you actually evaluate these outputs? And think of AI as a collaborator that you would dialogue with rather than just accepting the first output.
Excellent. And you also mentioned the lesson that we can learn from Fortune 500 AI implementation. Now, I have two questions here. So, first, what are the main real world lessons that we can learn from that? But also, when we have people listening to this saying, hey, we're a mid-sized business. We do not have the means that Fortune 500 companies have. So what can we learn from these implementation and probably what went wrong and not so wrong? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I'd say some of the main lessons. The first thing is that AI should not be thought of as an IT exercise. It should really be thought about as a business exercise in terms of how should we identify what are the new things we can do with this for our business that couldn't be done before. So that's a business problem, and that needs cross-functional leadership to get that right. So it's not just like an IT thing of which tool should we use and then give people access. So I'd say that's the first one. The second thing is once you've figured out what you might use it for and what technologies might be useful for it, um, it's important to think about how you can find efficiencies, but the risk is that you end up just automating your old existing business rather than thinking about how can you work in new ways that weren't possible before. So often in businesses, the processes and workflows that we have weren't really deliberately designed. They just kind of happened through happenstance and maybe were built around human limitations in terms of how we think and how we can only process certain numbers of things at a time, for example, right? Like I can only think about 6 or 8 ideas at a time as a person. So a lot of workflows are built like that, right? But actually, you can redesign workflows to figure out what are the things that AI could do that humans couldn't do, and actually build more interplay between humans and AI in your workflows. And so those human AI workflows end up looking very different than just automating your old ones. So those are the two big issues I see. In terms of looking at like a mid-market enterprise and how do they get involved, I think the first thing to say is that one thing that's remarkable is that not having lots of established decades of data and reams of research isn't actually a huge barrier. The access to data that LLMs have today means that even mid-market enterprises can have enormous access to data and maybe actually cleaner access to data than established enterprises do. So that's the first thing. I think the other piece is that you don't need to have everyone in your organization trained
Hmm.
in how to be an AI wizard, and you don't need to think about hiring expensive AI talent. I think this is a misconception is that you have to hire somebody who has done lots of work in AI before, and there aren't that many of those people just because of the moment in time that we are in. And so what's really important is think about how do you identify very high aptitude people who show a lot of passion for reinventing the way that they work anyway, get them interested in AI, identify what are experiments that they can run to figure out how they'd reinvent the way that the company does its work, and then create some loose governance around that, making sure that it's not seen just as an IT exercise, but putting structure and initiatives around a few areas that you think can have a big impact.
I think these are the perfect final words. When now people say, "Hey, I'd like to get in touch with you," how can people reach out to you?
Yeah, so people can reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's my main channel for communication. And then also at the website humanmachines.com, human-machines.com.
Perfect. Critical intelligence, strengthening human thinking in the age of AI. Geoff Gibbins, thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Niels.